There's a castle in Poland built on a mountain riddled with tunnels. Książ Castle, third largest castle in Poland, rising from forested hills in Lower Silesia. Medieval fortress transformed into Baroque palace. Beautiful, historic, impressive. And beneath it, kilometers of underground passages, Nazi construction, secret tunnels extending deep into the mountain, chambers carved from rock, a hidden city that was never finished. This is Książ, where medieval history meets Nazi mystery, where architectural beauty conceals subterranean darkness, where tunnels lead nowhere and secrets remain buried. Chapter 1. The Medieval Fortress and the Noble Dynasty, 1288 to 1605. The castle at Książ was founded in 1288 by Duke Bolko I, the strict of the Piast dynasty. The location was strategically chosen, a mountain rising 395 meters above sea level in Lower Silesia. Steep slopes on three sides providing natural defense, commanding views over the surrounding valleys and trade routes. The site offered both military advantage and symbolic power, a fortress visible for kilometers, proclaiming ducal authority over the territory. Duke Bolko I was consolidating power in the Duchy of Świdnica-Jawor, one of the fragmented principalities that emerged from the division of medieval Poland. The construction of a major fortress at Książ, the name derives from the German Fürstenstein, meaning prince's stone, was political statement as much as military necessity. The castle would serve as administrative center, military stronghold, and visible symbol of Piast legitimacy. The initial construction was purely defensive, stone walls following the mountain's contours, a central keep, corner towers. The architecture was Romanesque transitioning to Gothic, thick walls, small windows, emphasis on strength over comfort. This was fortress designed to withstand siege, not palace designed for luxury. The castle's position controlled important trade routes connecting Silesia with Bohemia. Merchants traveling between these regions passed through territory visible from Książ's towers. This provided economic leverage. The Duke could regulate trade, collect tolls, monitor commercial activity. The castle's value was as much economic as military. Through the 14th century, Książ remained in Piast control, as the dynasty's power ebbed and flowed with broader regional politics. The castle was expanded periodically. Additional defensive walls, more substantial towers. Living quarters improved gradually from Spartan military necessity to something approaching noble comfort. But the primary function remained military and administrative. In 1368, Duke Bolko II, grandson of the founder, made Książ his primary residence. This marked transition from purely military installation to ducal seat. The castle required upgrading to accommodate court functions, more elaborate residential quarters, spaces for administration and receiving visitors, chapel for religious observances. The fortress was becoming palace, but Bolko II died in 1368 without male heirs. His widow, Agnieszka, ruled as regent briefly before the territory passed to Bohemian crown through complex inheritance agreements. This began pattern that would define Książ for centuries, changing hands through dynastic politics rather than military conquest. Under Bohemian control from 1368, Książ became border fortress, guarding Bohemia's northern frontier. The military importance increased as the castle sat on contested boundary between Bohemian, Polish, and later Habsburg territories. Garrisons were maintained. Fortifications were reinforced. The castle served strategic defensive purposes for successive rulers. Dr. Romuald Kaczmarek is a historian at the University of Wrocław whose research focuses on medieval and early modern Lower Silesian fortifications and their role in regional power dynamics. Książ's history through medieval and early modern periods is defined by its strategic location and resulting political importance. The castle changed hands repeatedly, not through siege or conquest, but through inheritance, marriage alliances, and dynastic politics. Each new ruler recognized Książ's value and invested in maintaining or improving it. This created architectural layering, medieval fortress, Gothic additions, Renaissance modifications, all coexisting in the same structure. The castle became palimpsest of successive building campaigns. The 15th century brought Gothic architectural enhancements. The castle was expanded significantly. New wings added. The defensive walls extended. Gothic arched windows replaced smaller Romanesque openings in residential areas. The chapel was rebuilt in Gothic style. The fortress was becoming more palace-like while retaining military functionality. Local folklore began accumulating during this period. Stories about the castle's founding, legends about Duke Bolko I and his court, tales of treasure hidden in the mountain, the usual castle mythology. Every medieval fortress generated folklore, mixing historical memory with supernatural embellishment. One persistent legend claimed the mountain beneath Książ contained natural caverns where ancient peoples had lived before the castle was built. These supposed caverns were said to connect to underground passages created by medieval builders for escape routes during siege. The legend had some basis. The mountain's limestone composition did contain natural fissures and small caves, but the scale described in folklore far exceeded reality. In 1509, the castle passed to the Hochberg family through purchase. This marked beginning of the dynasty that would own Książ for over 4 centuries until World War II. The Hochbergs were wealthy Silesian nobles who recognized Książ's strategic and symbolic value. They invested heavily in transforming the fortress into residence worthy of their status. The 16th century saw Renaissance modifications. The Hochbergs modernized the interior, added more comfortable residential quarters, installed larger windows where defensive considerations allowed, commissioned decorative elements, frescoes, carved stonework, ornamental details that transformed Spartan fortress into aristocratic palace. But the military function remained. The Hochberg family maintained garrison, kept weapons stores, ensured the fortifications stayed defensible. Through the 16th century's religious conflicts and dynastic wars, Książ's position on the Bohemian Polish Habsburg frontier meant readiness for military action was constant necessity. By 1605, Książ was established as major aristocratic seat combining fortress and palace functions. The medieval defensive core remained, but was surrounded by more comfortable Renaissance additions. The castle served the Hochbergs as residence, administrative center for their extensive landholdings, and symbol of their noble status. The foundation was set for the Baroque transformation that would follow. Chapter 2. The Baroque Palace and the Hochberg Glory, 1605 to 1810. The 17th century transformed Książ from fortress into one of Silesia's most magnificent Baroque palaces. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, devastated much of Central Europe, but left Książ relatively unscathed. The castle's remote location and strong fortifications meant armies generally bypassed it. The Hochberg family used their wealth to ride out the conflict, while other noble families were ruined. When peace came in 1648, the Hochbergs emerged stronger, owning vast estates, commanding significant wealth, positioned to profit from post-war reconstruction. In 1650s, the family began the most ambitious building campaign in Książ's history. The goal was transforming the medieval Renaissance castle into Baroque palace that would rival the greatest aristocratic residences in the Holy Roman Empire. This required radical reconstruction, affecting every part of the structure. The medieval walls were retained for their defensive value and structural necessity, but everything else was rebuilt or dramatically modified. New Baroque wings were added. The interior was gutted and redesigned according to Baroque aesthetics. The fortress was being transformed into palace while maintaining the castle's commanding position and impressive silhouette. Italian architects were commissioned, bringing expertise in Baroque design that was transforming European architecture. They worked with local craftsmen to create uniquely Silesian interpretation of Baroque style. The result was synthesis of Italian architectural theory and regional building traditions. The work continued through late 1600s and into early 1700s. Each generation of Hochbergs added to the palace. Gardens were laid out in French Baroque style, geometric parterres, fountains, statuary, carefully controlled nature serving aesthetic purposes. The castle became centerpiece of elaborate landscape design extending across the mountainside. The interior was spectacular by any European aristocratic standard. Marble was imported from Italy. Frescoes covered ceilings and walls. Gilt ornamentation gleamed throughout. The chapel was rebuilt in Baroque splendor. Ballrooms accommodated hundreds. The Hochbergs were demonstrating their wealth and taste through architectural magnificence. By 1720, Książ was among the most impressive palaces in Silesia. The Baroque transformation was essentially complete. The medieval fortress had become aristocratic showcase. The Hochbergs hosted elaborate gatherings. The palace became center of regional, cultural, and political life. Artists, musicians, scholars visited. The castle represented Silesian noble culture at its height. But the mountain beneath remained mysterious. The cellars and storage areas extended deep into the rock. Natural caves and fissures were incorporated into the castle's foundation. The actual extent of underground spaces was poorly documented. Builders had worked with existing caverns and created additional storage chambers as needed. No comprehensive mapping existed. This created folklore about secret tunnels and hidden rooms. Local stories claimed the Hochbergs maintained escape routes extending kilometers underground. That treasure was hidden in chambers deep in the mountain. That ancient passages connected Książ to other castles in the region. The legends mixed architectural reality. There were substantial cellars and some natural caverns, with imaginative elaboration. Through the 18th century, Książ remained Hochberg's stronghold and cultural center. The family's wealth came from extensive landholdings, mining operations, and manufacturing enterprises across Silesia. The castle was their seat of power, political, economic, cultural. The Baroque palace on the mountain symbolized Hochberg dominance of the region. The palace collections grew to legendary proportions. Artworks by major European masters. Rare books and manuscripts in the library. Porcelain, tapestries, furniture representing centuries of aristocratic accumulation. The Hochbergs were collectors as well as builders. Książ became repository of cultural treasures. The gardens expanded to include terraces descending the mountainside. Baroque gave way to English landscape style in later 18th century modifications. The designed landscape eventually encompassed hundreds of hectares. The castle sat at the center of carefully orchestrated natural and architectural environment. Dr. Dorota Płaza is an art historian at the National Museum in Wrocław, specializing in Baroque architecture and aristocratic cultural patronage in Silesia. The Hochberg transformation of Książ represents the height of Silesian aristocratic ambition and cultural sophistication. They created palace that could compete with Habsburg or Prussian royal residences. The scale of investment, financial and cultural, was extraordinary. Książ became statement about Silesian nobility's place in European aristocratic hierarchy. The family used architecture to assert their status and demonstrate their power. The Napoleonic Wars brought crisis to the Hochberg family as to all European aristocracy. The invasions and occupations disrupted the social order. French armies swept through Silesia. The old certainties of aristocratic power were challenged by revolutionary ideology and military force. Książ survived physically. The French had no reason to damage a palace that could be occupied and used, but the political and social transformations threatened the aristocratic world that sustained the Hochbergs. The wars accelerated changes that would eventually undermine the feudal system supporting their power. By 1810, Napoleon's reorganization of European territories had placed Książ in the Kingdom of Saxony, a French client state. The Hochbergs adapted. Aristocratic families survived by flexibility. They maintained their properties through political maneuvering. The castle remained theirs, but the world around them was changing fundamentally. Chapter 3. The Industrial Age and the Last Hochbergs, 1810 to 1941. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 placed Książ and surrounding territories under Prussian control. The Hochberg family retained ownership of the castle and their estates, but they were now Prussian subjects rather than sovereign nobles. The family adapted to new political reality. Successive Hochbergs served in Prussian administration and military. They maintained their wealth through careful management of properties and successful adaptation to industrial economy developing across Silesia. The 19th century brought industrial transformation to Silesia. Coal mining expanded dramatically. Manufacturing grew. Railways connected previously remote areas. The region became one of the most industrialized in Europe. The Hochbergs profited by adapting to these changes. They owned mineral rights, invested in industrial enterprises, benefited from economic modernization. Książ was modified to accommodate changing aristocratic lifestyle. Gas lighting was installed in the 1840s. Plumbing improvements followed. Telegraph connections in the 1860s. Later, electricity. The Baroque Palace was modernized with 19th-century technology while maintaining its historical appearance. The castle became comfortable modern residence within historic structure. The family continued collecting art and expanding the palace's cultural holdings. By late 19th century, the library contained over 60,000 volumes. The art collection included works by Rubens, Van Dyck, and other masters. The castle was private museum as much as residence. The underground spaces beneath the castle were expanded periodically for practical purposes. Wine cellars were carved deeper into the rock. Storage facilities were enlarged. Some natural caverns were stabilized and incorporated into the castle's infrastructure. But these expansions were modest and utilitarian, nothing approaching the scale of later Nazi construction. World War I brought crisis. The Hochbergs were Prussian patriots. Family members served in the German military. The war strained even wealthy families' resources. But Książ survived the war intact. The castle was far from the fighting. The family's properties were not destroyed. After Germany's defeat in 1918, Książ found itself in changed political landscape. The Treaty of Versailles redrew European borders. Silesia was divided between Germany and newly reconstituted Poland. Książ remained on the German side, in the Prussian province that became part of the Weimar Republic. The interwar period was difficult for German aristocracy. Inflation devastated wealth. Political instability threatened property rights. The Hochbergs struggled financially. Maintaining Książ became increasingly burdensome. The enormous palace required constant expensive upkeep. The family considered selling but couldn't find buyers for property of such scale. Hans Heinrich XV, the last private owner of Książ, inherited the castle in 1938. He was 30 years old, educated, cultured, heir to centuries of family history. He loved Książ and was committed to preserving it despite financial challenges. He had no idea his tenure would last only 3 years. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. Hans Heinrich was drafted into the Wehrmacht. He served as officer on the Eastern Front. The castle remained nominally his property, but was increasingly controlled by Nazi authorities requisitioning properties for war purposes. In 1941, the Nazi government formally expropriated Książ. Hans Heinrich retained theoretical ownership, but had no control. The castle was taken over by Organization Todt, the Nazi civil and military engineering group responsible for major construction projects across occupied territories. What happened next transformed Książ more dramatically than any previous change in its 650-year history. The Nazis began construction project of staggering ambition, converting the Baroque Palace into fortress and carving massive underground complex into the mountain beneath it. The purpose of this construction remains partially mysterious even 8 decades later. The official designation was Project Riese, Project Giant. Multiple underground facilities were built across the region. Książ was the largest and most elaborate. But what the Nazis intended to build in those tunnels has never been definitively established. Chapter 4. Project Riese and the Underground Construction, 1941 to 1945. In 1941, Organization Todt arrived at Książ with plans to transform the castle and hollow out the mountain beneath it. The project was part of Project Riese, Project Giant, a network of underground facilities being constructed across Lower Silesia. The stated purpose was creating bomb-proof headquarters and industrial facilities safe from Allied air raids. As the war turned against Germany and strategic bombing intensified, the Nazi leadership sought underground protection for command centers and weapons production. But the scale of construction at Książ exceeded any defensive necessity. The plans called for kilometers of tunnels, massive chambers carved from rock, underground facilities that would extend hundreds of meters into the mountain. The ambition suggested purpose beyond merely sheltering from bombs. Several theories about Książ's intended function have been proposed based on fragmentary evidence. The tunnels might have been designed as headquarters for Hitler himself, a Führerhauptquartier safe from Allied bombing. Some evidence suggests this was seriously considered, particularly given the elaborate ventilation shafts and reinforced ceilings that suggest long-term habitation rather than industrial storage. Or they might have been intended for high-level Nazi leadership, a refuge where government could continue functioning even as Germany was being overrun. The proximity to Berlin, reachable by rail in under 3 hours from Leipzig, supported this interpretation. Another theory proposes the complex was designed for secret weapons production. Germany was developing advanced weapons, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, possibly nuclear weapons research. Underground facilities would protect development and manufacturing from Allied air raids. Książ's size and the construction scale support this interpretation. The wide dimensions of certain tunnel sections, wide enough to drive vehicles through, suggest industrial function rather than accommodation. Or the purpose might have been treasure storage. As Germany faced defeat, Nazi leadership began hiding looted art and gold. The Książ tunnels could have been planned as secure storage for cultural treasures and financial assets stolen from across occupied Europe. Evidence exists that some looting did occur at the castle itself. The Hochberg art collection was catalogued by Nazi officers in 1941, and much of it disappeared shortly afterward. Dr. Helmut Neumeier is a German historian who has studied Project Riese extensively, including archival research in German military and construction documents. The true purpose of Książ's underground construction was never documented definitively in surviving records. This may be because the plans changed as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, or because the project was secret even within Nazi hierarchy, or because documents were deliberately destroyed. We have fragmentary evidence supporting multiple theories. The most likely explanation is that purposes evolved, initially conceived as one thing, adapted to changing circumstances, never completed enough to reveal final intention. The construction method was brutal in its efficiency. Organization Todt engineers surveyed the mountain in late 1941 and identified entry points for tunneling. The granite and gneiss rock at Książ was dense and hard, resistant to explosion but capable of bearing substantial structural load once carved, making it ideal for underground facilities. Drilling teams marked out tunnel trajectories. Explosives were packed into drill holes. The detonations began. Each blast cycle followed the same pattern. Teams would drill dozens of holes into the rock face using pneumatic drills. Experienced drillers, typically Organization Todt engineers or skilled craftsmen drawn from occupied countries, placed explosive charges. Workers were cleared to minimum safe distances, a distance frequently underestimated in the crush of construction pressure. After detonation, the debris was cleared by hand. Prisoner labor brigades shoveled loose rock into carts that ran along temporary rail tracks laid in the tunnel floor. The carts were pushed by hand to collection points outside, where the spoil was dumped into the surrounding forests and valleys. Then the cycle began again. Drill, blast, clear. Drill, blast, clear. The tunnels advanced at varying rates depending on rock quality and labor availability. On productive days, excavation might progress 3 or 4 meters forward. On days plagued by equipment failures, guard disruptions, or prisoner deaths requiring replacements, progress could slow to almost nothing. The engineering records that survived suggest the tunnels at Książ consumed approximately 40,000 cubic meters of excavated rock over the construction period, an almost incomprehensible volume of material removed by hand labor from within a mountain. The construction camps were established at multiple sites around Książ in early 1942. The primary camp, designated Arbeitslager Książ, was built in the valley below the castle. A second camp occupied cleared forest approximately 2 kilometers to the southeast. A third, smaller installation was established near the Wałbrzych Road. Together, these camps could house several thousand prisoners at peak construction. The prisoners at Książ came primarily from Gross Rosen concentration camp, located approximately 60 kilometers away near the present-day town of Rogoźnica. Gross Rosen was a major slave labor facility that supplied workers to dozens of industrial projects across Lower Silesia. By 1944, it held over 70,000 prisoners, making it one of the largest camp complexes in the German system. From this reservoir of human misery, Książ drew its workforce. Prisoners arrived in groups ranging from a few dozen to several hundred, marched or transported by truck from Gross Rosen to supplement existing labor or replace those who had died. The prisoner population at Książ was diverse in origin and deeply international in its tragedy. Jewish prisoners constituted the majority, drawn from across occupied Europe: Poland, France, Hungary, the Netherlands, Greece. Soviet prisoners of war arrived in significant numbers after 1942, their status under German law affording them even fewer protections than concentration camp inmates. Poles not classified as Jewish, political prisoners, underground members, those caught in random roundups, were present throughout the construction period. Smaller numbers came from other occupied territories: Belgians, Czechs, Italians after 1943, and others. Each group faced slightly different treatment, according to the Nazi hierarchy of dehumanization, but all faced the same fundamental reality of brutal exploitation. They were tools to be consumed by the construction project. Their physical survival mattered only insofar as they could continue working. The testimony of survivors, collected by Polish and German researchers in the decades following the war, provides the most direct window into daily life in the Książ camps. Mordecai Stern, a Jewish prisoner from Łódź who passed through the Książ camp in 1943, later described in a deposition taken in Israel the experience of arriving at the site after a forced march from Gross Rosen. We walked through the night. We could hear the castle above us but could not see it. They put us in a building. It had been some kind of storage shed, I think, before they made it into barracks. There were shelves of boards, 3 high for sleeping. There was straw, maybe 200 men in a space for 50. The smell, I cannot describe it. In the morning they counted us, and if the count was wrong, we stood until it was right, sometimes for hours, regardless of cold. The daily routine was rigid and dehumanizing. Roll call before dawn, lasting until counts were satisfied. A process that could take minutes or hours, depending on guards' temperament and whether anyone had died overnight. A portion of watery soup and bread distributed before the march to the work site. 10 to 12 hours of physical labor inside the tunnel, broken by a midday distribution of more soup that prisoners often ate standing because no seating was provided. Return march to camp. Evening roll call. Sleep. Begin again. The work itself was physically annihilating. The pneumatic drills vibrated violently and required sustained upper body strength to operate. Workers who lost their grip could have drills break their fingers or wrists. The compressed air systems were maintained poorly, and burst hoses were a source of both injury and disciplinary beatings. Guards who heard air escaping assumed workers had sabotaged equipment. Clearing blasted rock required continuous bending and lifting, loading hundredweight of broken stone into carts that then had to be pushed along uneven temporary tracks. Those who fell behind the pace set by capos, prisoner overseers selected for their brutality, were beaten. The explosions were a constant terror. The blast radii were frequently underestimated, particularly in sections where the rock composition changed unexpectedly. Fragments traveled farther than engineers predicted. Workers assigned to drilling operations near active blast sites reported being showered with rock debris even from supposedly safe distances. Men lost eyes. Eardrums ruptured. And occasionally, failures in the clearing procedure meant workers were still present when detonations occurred. These accidents were recorded minimally, if at all. A dead prisoner was simply removed and replaced. Silicosis was a slow killer that claimed many who survived more immediate dangers. The granite dust generated by drilling coated lungs permanently. Men who survived the camps and lived for years after the war died in their 60s of respiratory failure traceable directly to what was inhaled in those tunnels. A slow death rarely counted in wartime casualty figures, making the true human cost even harder to calculate. Hypothermia took others working in tunnel sections where groundwater seeped continuously from walls and ceilings. The mountain interior held a constant 8 to 10 degrees, regardless of season. Dangerous for malnourished men in thin clothing who were perpetually wet from above. The guards who oversaw the Książ camps included SS personnel, organization taught security, and prisoner capos. The capo system, in which some prisoners were granted privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline on fellow inmates, created a secondary layer of violence that was sometimes more brutal than that inflicted by guards directly. Capos, who failed to maintain work pace, faced loss of status and privileges, an incentive structure that turned some prisoners into agents of their own people's suffering. Guard violence was casual and continuous. Beatings for insufficient work pace were common. Beatings for perceived disrespect were common. Beatings for no reason that witnesses could determine were common. Former prisoner Jerzy Nowak, a Polish political prisoner from Warsaw who survived Książ and Gross Rosen and later provided testimony to Polish judicial investigators, described a guard known among prisoners only by his nickname, Rotor, who selected prisoners arbitrarily for beatings as a form of entertainment during his shifts. He would walk along the column returning from work and just pick someone. There was no logic. It could be anyone. So you learned to walk in the middle of the column, to be invisible. But you could not always be invisible. The exact death toll at Książ cannot be established with precision because Nazi administrative systems, while generally meticulous in their records, maintained incomplete documentation at Project Riese sites. This incompleteness was likely deliberate. The deaths at construction camps were an embarrassment even within the Nazi system, which preferred to maintain the fiction that slave labor was sustainable and that workers were being treated adequately for purposes of production. In reality, the mortality rates at Książ and other Riese sites were so high that they threatened the project's completion. Workers were dying faster than they could be replaced with trained laborers. Research by the Gross-Rosen Museum, drawing on surviving camp records, transfer documents, and post-war testimony, estimates that between 1942 and 1945, approximately 5,000 prisoners died across the entire Project Riese complex in Lower Silesia. At Książ specifically, current scholarly estimates suggest several hundred deaths at minimum, with some historians placing the figure above 1,000 when accounting for undocumented deaths and those who died after transfer. Bodies were buried in mass graves in the forest around the castle. Several of these burial sites have been identified through post-war investigation, and human remains were still being discovered decades after the war's end. The castle above ground was undergoing its own transformation, though this one was in reverse. Where previous centuries had progressively refined a military fortress into an aristocratic palace, the Nazis were stripping everything refined back to utilitarian function. The Baroque frescoes that had survived generations of Hochberg family life were covered over with whitewash, or simply smashed when walls were restructured. Marble floors were ripped up. Decorative stonework was chipped away where it interfered with the installation of reinforced concrete supports. The elegant windows that had been enlarged in the Baroque period to admit light into aristocratic apartments were bricked up or reduced to defensive slits. The Hochbergs had spent 2 centuries making Książ comfortable and beautiful. The Nazis undid all of it in 3 years. The gardens suffered complete destruction. The Baroque terracing and formal plantings were bulldozed to create flat defensive positions. Anti-aircraft batteries were installed on elevated points where the Hochberg family had cultivated ornamental gardens. The greenhouse complex, which had maintained exotic plants through Silesian winters, was converted to storage. The designed landscape that had extended across hundreds of hectares was obliterated. In its place, fortifications, military installations, the utilitarian ugliness of a site prepared for last-ditch defense. Underground, the tunnels continued their descent into the mountain as 1944 wore on. Some passages reached depths of 50 meters below the castle's foundations. Chambers were carved to heights of 15 meters, suggesting they were designed to accommodate large machinery or substantial storage. The engineering invested in ventilation was particularly sophisticated. A network of shafts and channels designed to provide fresh air throughout the complex, suggesting sustained occupation, was planned. Drainage systems were installed to manage groundwater. The construction quality, where it was completed, was high, clearly intended to last decades, not months. But the war's trajectory was becoming impossible to ignore even at a remote mountain construction site. By mid-1944, the Allied advance in the west and the Soviet advance in the east were both accelerating. Resources that had flowed to Project Riese, steel, concrete, specialized equipment, were being diverted to military uses. The labor supply was disrupted as transportation became unreliable and other facilities required workers. The pace of construction slowed. Sections that had been planned were never begun. Some tunnels were driven part-way, then abandoned when engineering priorities shifted. The incomplete underground city was becoming more incomplete with every passing month. As January 1945 opened, Soviet forces were crossing the Vistula River in their winter offensive. Poland, east of the Oder, was being overrun at a pace that stunned even German military planners who had expected resistance to slow the advance. The Nazi authorities at Książ began the process of evacuation and destruction. Documents were burned, administrative records, construction blueprints, correspondence between Organization Todt and Berlin that might reveal the project's true purpose. Equipment that could be moved was loaded onto trucks and taken west. Anything that couldn't be transported was sabotaged. The forced labor camps were emptied in stages throughout January and February 1945. Prisoners who could walk were formed into columns and marched westward in conditions that became immediately deadly. Winter temperatures in Lower Silesia can fall to -20 degrees Celsius. Prisoners in thin clothing, weakened by years of malnutrition and exhaustion, marched through snow and ice with minimal food and water. Those who fell were shot or left to freeze. The death marches from Project Riese sites killed an estimated 25 to 35% of those who departed. Men and women who had survived the camps dying in the snow in the final weeks of a war that was already lost. The demolition of the tunnels was attempted but proved more difficult than the Nazi engineers anticipated. Explosives were placed at key structural points to collapse passageways and block access. Some detonations succeeded in bringing down sections of tunnel. Rock was dislodged, passages were partially blocked, and several chamber openings were sealed. But the mountain itself resisted complete destruction. The granite and gneiss that had been so difficult to excavate was equally difficult to demolish completely. Controlled collapses in one section failed to propagate along tunnel networks the way planners hoped. The demolition was hasty. The personnel carrying it out were simultaneously preparing their own retreat westward, and fundamentally incomplete. When Soviet forces from the First Ukrainian Front reached the Wałbrzych area and captured Książ in May 1945, they found something extraordinary and inexplicable. The Baroque Palace was a ruin, its interiors gutted, its beauty destroyed, its grounds converted to military installation. But beneath it, carved into the living rock of the mountain, was a network of tunnels and chambers extending for kilometers in multiple directions. The passages were largely intact. Some sections were flooded with groundwater that the Nazi demolition had disrupted pumping systems to drain. Other sections were blocked by the deliberate collapses. But substantial portions of the underground complex were accessible and clearly the product of enormous effort. The Soviet officers who descended into the tunnels found them almost entirely empty. Abandoned tools rusted where they had been dropped. Temporary rail tracks for the spoil carts remained in place. Electric cable installations, the tunnels had been wired for lighting, hung from the walls. Some sections showed the marks of hasty activity. Scuff marks from heavy objects dragged along floors. Indentations where large pieces of equipment had stood. But whatever had been there was gone. The mystery of what the tunnels were for remained because the people who might have answered the question were dead, fled, or keeping their secrets. The prisoners who had built the tunnels knew only the work itself, not the purpose. The Nazi officials who had directed the project had scattered. The documents that might have explained it had been burned. The underground city sat beneath the ruined palace, carved from the mountain at the cost of hundreds of lives, empty and inexplicable. The Soviets explored the tunnels systematically. They found no treasure, no secret weapons, no evidence of nuclear research, just empty passages and carved chambers. Whatever the Nazis had intended to store or build, there had never materialized. The tunnels were testament to ambition that exceeded capability and time. The mystery of what the tunnels were for remained because the Nazis who planned them were dead or silent. The prisoners who built them had no knowledge of the purpose. They only knew brutal work and death. The physical evidence, kilometers of passages, existed without explanation. And this created the legends that persist today. Theories about Nazi gold hidden in sealed chambers. Stories about secret rooms containing looted art. Claims about documents revealing Hitler's fate. The underground complex became repository for every Nazi mystery and treasure-hunting fantasy. The reality incomplete construction project abandoned by desperate regime, was less dramatic than the myths. Chapter 5. The Legends and the Treasure Hunters, 1945 to 1990. The incomplete Nazi tunnels beneath Książ became source of persistent legends almost immediately after the war. The first stories emerged from Soviet soldiers who explored the complex in 1945. They reported finding strange architectural features, chambers whose purpose was unclear, passages that seemed to lead nowhere, inscriptions in German they couldn't translate. These reports, filtered through language barriers and wartime confusion, became basis for myths about secret Nazi purposes. One legend claimed the tunnels contained Hitler's personal archives, documents that would reveal the truth about Nazi leadership, war crimes, possibly Hitler's fate if he had survived beyond his supposed suicide in the Berlin bunker. This theory had no evidence, but appealed to people who wanted to believe Hitler escaped justice. The sealed tunnels became, in this mythology, the vault containing proof. Another persistent story involved Nazi gold. The legend claimed that as Germany collapsed, the Nazi leadership transported gold reserves, stolen wealth, and looted cultural treasures to secure locations. Książ's tunnels were supposedly one such location. The gold was allegedly sealed in hidden chambers before the war ended. Thousands of tons of bullion supposedly remained buried in the mountain. This treasure legend was fueled by factual basis. The Nazis did loot massive amounts of wealth and art from occupied territories. Some was recovered. Much disappeared. The Książ tunnels were plausible hiding place, but no evidence beyond speculation supported the specific claim that treasure was actually there. The Nazi train legend became most famous. According to this story, in early 1945, a German train carrying gold, art, and valuables entered a tunnel near Książ and never emerged. The tunnel was supposedly sealed with explosives, trapping the train and its cargo underground. The legend specified location, described the cargo, even claimed witnesses saw the train enter but not exit. This legend persisted for decades despite lack of evidence. It was fueled by occasional reports of unusual ground-penetrating radar readings near Książ. Treasure hunters periodically claimed to have located the train. Media coverage amplified each claim. But no train was ever found because no train existed. The legend was compelling mythology without factual foundation. Dr. Joanna Lamparska is a historian and author who has researched the post-war legends surrounding Książ and Project Riese extensively. The treasure legends served psychological function for both Germans and Poles after the war. For Germans who had supported or tolerated Nazis, the treasure represented lost glory, something valuable that had been hidden, waiting to be recovered. For Poles in devastated post-war Poland, the treasure represented possible economic salvation, if only it could be found. The legends were more about contemporary needs than historical truth. People wanted to believe the treasure existed because they needed something to hope for. The Polish communist authorities who controlled Książ after the war conducted their own explorations. They too searched for treasure. Military engineers surveyed the tunnels. Mining experts examined the rock. Archaeologists investigated chambers. Nothing of significant value was found. Some minor artifacts, rusted equipment, empty spaces, but no gold, no art, no treasure. This didn't stop the legends. In fact, official denials fueled conspiracy theories. If authorities claimed there was no treasure, that proved there was treasure they wanted to keep secret. The logic was circular but psychologically satisfying to believers. The tunnels became repository for every conspiracy theory and treasure-hunting fantasy that post-war chaos enabled. The first formal private expedition dedicated specifically to finding Książ treasure was organized in 1952 by a loosely affiliated group of former German soldiers and local Polish laborers who had worked in the Wałbrzych area during the reconstruction period. The group, led by a former engineer named Eric Bredow, who had worked for Organization Taut and claimed first-hand knowledge of the construction, descended into accessible tunnel sections with rudimentary equipment, flashlights, rope, hand tools. Bredow claimed to know of a sealed side chamber approximately 200 meters into the main east-running tunnel where documents and bullion had been deposited in February 1945. The group searched for 3 days. They found the tunnel end Bredow had described, but no sealed chamber, no documents, no bullion. Bredow maintained the entrance had been disguised with shaped rock and concrete. The others were less convinced. The expedition ended without agreement about what, if anything, had been discovered. This pattern, a leader claiming specific knowledge, an expedition reaching a promising location, a disputed interpretation of negative results, would repeat itself dozens of times over the following decades. Each expedition added details to the legend while finding nothing of substance. The legends grew more elaborate with each iteration, incorporating new claimants and new specifics that seemed to anchor them in verifiable reality while remaining ultimately unverifiable. Through the 1950s and 60s, Książ was state property under communist government. The castle was used for various purposes, briefly as hospital, then as hotel for trade union members, eventually as museum and tourist site. But the tunnels remained largely closed to public. This secrecy, motivated by safety concerns about unstable passages, fed speculation about what was being hidden. The communist secret police, the SB in Poland and the Stasi in nearby East Germany, maintained their own interest in Książ's supposed secrets. Declassified documents released after 1989 reveal that both services ran informants in Wałbrzych and the surrounding area specifically tasked with monitoring treasure hunting activity and reporting on anyone claiming to have genuine information about the tunnel contents. The surveillance was extensive, reflecting governmental conviction, at least through the 1960s, that something of value might genuinely be hidden in the mountain. No informant ever reported finding anything credible. The legend of the Nazi train received its most significant elaboration in the late 1950s, through the testimony of a man who identified himself only as Stanisław K., a former Polish railroad worker who had allegedly been employed at Wałbrzych station in early 1945. Stanisław claimed to have personally observed an unmarked German train of approximately 15 cars entering a tunnel siding near the town in late January or early February 1945, drawing cars covered with tarpaulins that railroad workers were forbidden from approaching. The train, he said, never returned from that siding. He claimed the tunnel entrance was sealed with explosives within days of the train's arrival. His testimony, given to a Polish regional newspaper in 1958, was vague on precise dates, locations, and other verifiable details, but it provided the narrative skeleton that subsequent treasure hunters would flesh out with increasingly specific claims. The account circulated through the amateur history community and eventually reached international audiences, appearing in German, British, and American publications about Nazi treasure by the 1970s. The first organized use of technology in the search came in 1967, when a team of geologists from the Wrocław Technical University undertook what they described as a purely academic geological survey of the mountain beneath Książ, with permission from castle administration. Their tools were primarily seismic, small explosive charges detonated at the surface, with sensors recording how the sound waves traveled through the mountain's interior. Differences in wave travel time could suggest chambers or voids not visible from the tunnel system. The survey identified several anomalies, areas where seismic waves behaved unexpectedly, suggesting possible void spaces within the rock. These anomalies were recorded academically and published in a geology journal. Treasure hunters seized on the publication immediately. Here was scientific evidence of hidden chambers. The geologist's own interpretation, that the anomalies likely reflected natural fracture zones in the granite, was largely ignored by the treasure community. What mattered was that something was in there. Occasional unauthorized explorers penetrated the tunnels through the 1970s. They reported strange discoveries, bricked-up passages suggesting sealed chambers, architectural features they couldn't explain. Occasionally, small artifacts left by Nazi construction crews. These reports circulated informally, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The underground complex became Polish folklore, combining historical reality with imaginative elaboration. In 1969, a self-described treasure hunter named Władysław Marchewski published a small book in Wrocław outlining his theory that the Książ tunnel complex contained sealed chambers holding the Amber Room, the legendary decorative installation taken from the Catherine Palace near Leningrad by German troops in 1941 and never definitively located after the war. Marchewski's evidence was circumstantial. The Amber Room had been in German custody. It had last been documented in Königsberg before Soviet forces arrived. Nazi officers known to have overseen its removal from Königsberg were later stationed in Lower Silesia, and Książ had the tunnel infrastructure to accommodate large-scale storage. The Amber Room theory added cultural grandeur to the treasure legend. This was not just gold and cash, but one of the world's great lost artworks. Marchewski's book sold out its print run, and was reprinted twice. He spent the remaining years of his life seeking permission for excavation that never came. The treasure hunting became occasional news story through the 1970s. Someone would claim to have found evidence of the Nazi train or hidden chambers. Media would cover it. Experts would investigate. Nothing would be found. The cycle repeated every few years. Each time, public interest was rekindled. Each time, the legends were reinforced, despite failure to find anything. In 1983, a West German journalist named Karl-Heinz Drechsler published a lengthy investigation in a Hamburg magazine arguing that the Nazi train legend was based on a deliberate post-war disinformation campaign orchestrated by surviving SS officers to distract attention from where treasures were actually hidden. Not at Książ, but at a different location entirely. Drexler's article was itself largely speculative, but it added a new layer of complexity to the legend. Now the story about Książ might be a cover story. Perhaps the real treasure was somewhere else, and Książ was a decoy. This interpretation gave ammunition to believers when Książ yielded nothing. Of course, it yielded nothing. That was the point. In 1989, as communism fell and Poland underwent democratic transformation, Książ became more accessible. Tourism increased. The tunnels were opened for guided tours. Visitors could walk passages that Nazis had carved, see the incomplete chambers, experience the underground mystery directly. This accessibility demystified some legends while reinforcing others. Seeing the actual tunnels made clear they weren't treasure vaults. They were incomplete construction, abandoned in haste. But the physical reality also suggested possibilities. The passages were extensive. Some areas remained unexplored. Maybe treasure existed in sections not yet discovered. Modern treasure hunters used increasingly sophisticated technology. Ground-penetrating radar systems, originally developed for archaeological survey and civil engineering, were adapted for treasure hunting purposes. These devices emitted radar pulses into the ground and recorded returns from subsurface features, producing images that could suggest walls, voids, or dense materials at depths of several meters. The technology was genuinely useful for specific applications. At Książ, it proved repeatedly unable to find hidden chambers because hidden chambers did not exist. But the radar images required interpretation, and a sufficiently motivated interpreter could find ambiguity in almost any readout. Electromagnetic induction sensors, capable of detecting metal concentrations underground, were employed by several expeditions in the 1980s. When a sensor registered anomalous metal content in an area of tunnel floor or mountain slope, treasure hunters interpreted this as confirmation of buried gold. Geological analysis consistently identified the anomalies as naturally occurring mineral concentrations or as fragments of the metal equipment, rail track sections, cable runs, structural supports that the Nazis had left behind throughout the tunnel system. The explanation was mundane. The legend demanded something more exciting. By 1990, serious historians and archaeologists had thoroughly debunked the treasure legends. The Nazi train didn't exist. The gold chambers were fantasy. The hidden art was mythology. The tunnels were exactly what they appeared to be: incomplete military construction abandoned when Germany lost the war. But the legends persisted, despite debunking. Because legends serve needs that facts don't address. The mystery was more appealing than mundane reality. The possibility of treasure was more exciting than historical truth. The underground complex remained mythological space even as it became touristic attraction. The most dramatic confrontation between legend and reality came in August 2015, when two men, Piotr Koper, a Polish treasure hunter, and Andreas Richter, a German amateur historian, held a press conference in Leipzig, announcing that they had found the Nazi gold train. They claimed their ground-penetrating radar survey of an area of hillside approximately 4 kilometers from Książ showed an unmistakable anomaly: an underground void approximately 150 meters long, consistent in dimension with a tunnel containing a train. They had deathbed testimony, they said, from an elderly man who claimed his grandfather had been present when the train was sealed underground. They were legally claiming a finder's fee of 10% of whatever was recovered, a figure they calculated at potentially 65 million euros. The media response was extraordinary. The story circulated in over 40 countries within 72 hours. CNN, the BBC, newspapers across Europe and North America reported the claim. Leipzig municipal offices were overwhelmed with calls from journalists and would-be treasure hunters. The Polish Minister of Culture issued a statement, acknowledging the claim while cautioning that nothing had been verified. The area Koper and Richter indicated was cordoned off, partly to prevent amateur digging that might compromise any excavation, partly to manage the media circus gathering at the site. The formal investigation was authorized by Polish authorities and conducted by a team that included railway engineers, archaeologists, geologists, and military historians. Drilling rigs were brought to the site. Core samples were extracted from multiple points above the claimed tunnel location. Ground-penetrating radar of higher specification than Koper and Richter had used was deployed across the entire area. Geologists analyzed the subsurface stratigraphy. The results, published by the Polish Geological Survey in late 2015 and confirmed by independent analysis, were unambiguous. There was no tunnel. There was no train. The anomalies in the original radar scans were geological formations, layers of rock with different densities that produced the reading Koper and Richter had interpreted as a constructed void. The drilling found undisturbed natural rock throughout. No railway infrastructure, no evidence of human construction, no train. Koper and Richter disputed the findings. They argued the search had been conducted in the wrong location, that the geological survey had missed the relevant area, that the results were being suppressed to protect whatever was hidden. Dr. Lamparska, who had been consulted during the investigation, was characteristically direct in her assessment. The problem with the Nazi train legend is not that it was never properly investigated. It has now been properly investigated with the most sophisticated technology available by qualified professionals operating under full public scrutiny. The problem is that some people simply cannot accept a negative result. For them, nothing found will always mean search in the wrong place. You cannot disprove a legend to someone who needs the legend to exist. The 2015 episode definitively proved the Nazi train legend was false to anyone willing to accept evidence. Yet even this conclusive debunking didn't completely kill the legend. Some treasure hunters still believe, searching for alternative locations or claiming the excavation was cover-up. The legend had become too embedded in the regional identity of Wałbrzych and too lucrative as a tourism draw to surrender entirely to historical truth. Chapter 6. The Communist Period and the Castle's Resurrection, 1945 to 1989. When Soviet forces occupied Książ in May 1945, the castle was devastated. The Nazi conversion to fortress had destroyed most of the Baroque interiors. 300 years of Hochberg cultural accumulation was gone, gutted, looted, or destroyed. The art collection had been dispersed, some pieces stolen by Nazis, some by Soviet soldiers, most simply disappeared. The library of 60,000 volumes was largely destroyed. The palace was hollow shell. The underground tunnels were flooded. The Nazis had destroyed pumping equipment before retreating. Groundwater filled the lower passages. The complex became partially inaccessible. This flooding would persist for decades, preventing complete exploration and feeding speculation about what might be hidden in submerged sections. Hans Heinrich XV, the last private owner, survived the war and attempted to reclaim his property. He was in American-occupied Germany when the war ended. He filed claims for Książ's return based on his ownership rights. The claims were rejected. Poland's borders had shifted westward under Yalta agreements. Książ was now in Polish territory. German property claims were void. Hans Heinrich spent remaining decades of his life. He died in 1992, seeking compensation or return of the castle. He never received either. The Hochberg ownership that had lasted from 1509 to 1941 was permanently terminated. The family's 400-year connection to Książ was severed by war and politics. The Polish communist government took control. They designated Książ as state property. The question became, what to do with a ruined Baroque palace sitting atop incomplete Nazi tunnels in remote mountain location? Initial proposals varied wildly. Some suggested demolishing the castle as symbol of German occupation and aristocratic oppression. The structure represented feudalism and fascism. Both ideologies communism opposed. Destruction would erase these associations. Others argued for preservation. Whatever its past, Książ was architecturally and historically significant. Destroying it would be cultural vandalism. Poland had lost enormous cultural heritage during the war. Deliberately destroying more seemed counterproductive, even from communist ideological perspective. Pragmatism won. The castle was too large and remote to serve most practical purposes, but it could generate revenue through tourism. Poland needed foreign currency. Historic sites attracted visitors. Książ could be restored sufficiently to become tourist destination while serving communist ideological purposes through controlled historical interpretation. The ideological framework that Communist Poland applied to Książ's history in its early years of control was revealing in what it emphasized and what it suppressed. The castle's medieval and Baroque periods were interpreted through a class struggle lens. The fortress was built by exploited peasant labor for the benefit of feudal aristocrats. The Baroque Palace represented the decadent wealth extracted from the working masses by the Hochberg dynasty. This framing allowed the communist government to appropriate the castle's heritage while condemning the social system that produced it. The Hochbergs were not presented as cultured patrons of the arts, but as exploiters whose accumulated luxury came at the cost of the people who worked their estates. The Nazi period was handled with considerably more ideological complexity. Communist Poland's official narrative of the Second World War emphasized Soviet and Polish resistance, the heroism of the Red Army, the crimes of German fascism, and the liberation of Poland by Soviet forces. This narrative was essentially true in its broad strokes, but distorted through emphasis and omission. At Książ, The forced labor construction was acknowledged in broad terms. Germans had used slave labor to build tunnels, but the details of who the victims were and how they died were given minimal attention. The Jewish identity of many victims was particularly downplayed, consistent with the Soviet-influenced tendency to present Holocaust victims primarily as victims of fascism generally, rather than of specifically anti-Semitic genocide. The restoration began slowly in the 1950s. Resources were scarce. Poland was rebuilding from war devastation. Książ was low priority, but basic stabilization work prevented further collapse. Roofs were repaired, structural issues were addressed. The castle was saved from ruin, even if full restoration was impossible. The first significant restoration effort focused on the castle's exterior in 1953 and 1954, when a team of stonemasons and structural engineers from the Wrocław Construction Trust undertook emergency repairs to sections of the main facade that were showing signs of imminent collapse. Scaffolding was erected along the south wall. Loose stonework was repointed. Structural cracks were injected with mortar. The Gothic towers received attention to their upper sections where water infiltration had damaged medieval stonework. This work was purely stabilizing. There was no pretense of restoration to historical appearance, but it ensured the exterior shell survived. Interior work was more complicated. The Nazi demolition had left several rooms structurally unstable, with floors compromised by modifications to the walls below and ceilings damaged by the weight of concrete reinforcement added above. Polish engineers worked through the late 1950s, assessing which rooms could be safely restored and which needed to be stabilized differently. Several chambers on the upper floors were permanently sealed as too dangerous to enter, let alone restore. Others were cleared of Nazi-era additions and brought to a basic state of structural safety, though they remained undecorated. A significant political decision was made at an administrative level in 1957. The communist authorities formally committed to restoring Książ as a historical monument and regional tourism destination rather than continuing to debate alternative uses. The decision was driven partly by the growing success of other Polish castle restorations. Wawel in Krakow had been receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, and partly by economic calculations about the potential of Lower Silesia's historic sites to attract both domestic tourism and the foreign currency that came with international visitors. The tunnels remained largely closed through this period. Safety concerns were genuine. The passages were unstable. Flooding persisted. Cave-ins were possible. But keeping them closed also prevented treasure hunting and reduced the castle's association with the Nazi period. The communist authorities preferred emphasizing Książ's older history over the recent Nazi occupation. When guides mentioned the tunnels at all in this early period, it was briefly and without detail. Visitors were told that Germans had built passages during the war and that they were currently closed for safety reasons. The forced labor, the deaths, and the human cost were not discussed. This deliberate silence around the Nazi period reflected broader patterns in Communist Poland's management of uncomfortable historical memory. The Holocaust was not officially commemorated in Poland until the 1960s, and even then in muted forms. The wartime suffering of the Jewish population, which had experienced near-total annihilation in Poland, was subsumed into generalizations about fascist crimes against humanity. At Książ specifically, this meant that the prisoners who had built the tunnels, many of them Polish Jews, Hungarian Jews, Greek Jews, Jewish people from across occupied Europe, were not named, not commemorated, not individually acknowledged. They were abstractions. The crimes committed against them were real, but rendered faceless. In 1974, the castle officially became museum. The restoration accelerated. Some Baroque interiors were reconstructed based on historical documentation and photographs from the Hochberg period. Not everything could be recovered. The art collection was gone, the original furnishings destroyed, but the architecture could be restored to approximate historical appearance. Dr. Mariusz Olczak is the current director of Książ Castle Museum and has overseen much of the recent restoration and development. The communist-era restoration was pragmatic rather than scholarly. The goal was creating functional tourist attraction, not perfectly accurate historical reconstruction. They restored what would impress visitors and generate revenue. The result was partial. Some rooms beautifully restored, others left in damaged state, the Nazi modifications sometimes preserved, sometimes removed, depending on practical considerations. The castle became mixture of periods and purposes rather than coherent historical presentation. The most ambitious restoration project of the communist period was the reconstruction of the Maximilians Hall, the large ceremonial room on the Piano Nobile that had served the Hochbergs as primary formal reception space. The hall had been gutted by the Nazis, but enough of its Baroque ceiling decoration survived in fragments and in pre-war photographs to allow a reconstruction. Polish craftsmen trained in traditional plastering techniques spent 2 years, from 1976 to 1978, recreating the coffered and frescoed ceiling. The colors were estimated from the surviving fragments. The figures were based on the photographic record, and the gilded moldings were new work designed to match historical profiles. The result was not original. No one pretended it was, but it gave visitors a genuine impression of Baroque magnificence and became the centerpiece of the castle's tourism offering. The Knights' Hall was restored in a similar spirit in 1980 and 1981, its paneling reconstructed in oak, and its heraldic decorations based on surviving documentation of the Hochberg family's extensive armorial bearings. The chapel received attention in 1977, its Gothic vaulting cleared of wartime damage and stabilized, though the Baroque furnishings that had once filled it could not be recreated for lack of documentation and funds. Several rooms in the south wing were opened to visitors in their damaged state, walls bare, floors rough, evidence of Nazi modifications visible, as a counterpoint to the restored rooms, demonstrating what had been lost, even if the presentation was not explicitly educational. What was explicitly not presented during the communist period was the full story of the Hochberg family. The family that had owned Książ for over 4 centuries was present in the restoration as a historical artifact, their crests, their portraits in reproduction, their documented architectural choices, but not as individual human beings with a history extending beyond 1945. Hans Heinrich XV, alive and actively seeking the castle's return from his residence in West Germany, was an inconvenient complication to the narrative of Książ as rightful Polish property. The communist-era interpretation presented the Hochbergs as a historical dynasty that had now appropriately ended, their property legitimately in the hands of the Polish state. That the last member of the dynasty was alive and disputing this narrative was not information that appeared in any museum display. Tourism developed steadily through 1970s and 80s. Książ became established destination for Poles and some international visitors. The Baroque rooms were impressive. The mountain location was scenic. The castle's history, minus thorough discussion of Nazi period, was marketable. The domestic tourism to Książ during the communist period drew heavily from the industrial workforce of Lower Silesia. Wałbrzych was a coal mining city. The surrounding region was heavily industrial. Workers and their families represented the primary tourist audience, and the castle's management oriented its programming accordingly. Group tours at accessible prices, a cafeteria serving simple meals, educational materials pitched at school groups. The castle became a destination for the Polish working class that the communist system claimed to serve, which created a certain ideological satisfaction for administrators, even if the Baroque aristocratic setting was an awkward fit for proletarian leisure. The tunnels were opened for limited tours in the 1980s. Visitors could walk selected passages deemed safe. The underground complex became attraction in itself. Mysterious, somewhat sinister, physically dramatic. Tour guides mentioned the Nazi construction, but didn't dwell on the forced labor and deaths. The presentation was sanitized for tourism. The guides who led these tunnel tours in the 1980s occupied an uncomfortable position. They were professionally trained to provide historical context for what visitors were seeing, but the historical context most directly relevant to the tunnels, the forced labor system, the prisoner deaths, the connection to Gross Rosen concentration camp, was precisely the context that institutional policy discouraged emphasizing. Guides defaulted to technical descriptions, the dimensions of the passages, the methods of construction, the engineering challenges that the Nazis faced in excavating the mountain. They noted that laborers had built the tunnels without lingering on who those laborers were or what had happened to them. Visitors were left with an impression of impressive construction, achieved through formidable, if unspecified, means. The treasure legends helped tourism. Visitors came hoping to see where the Nazi train might be hidden or where gold might be buried. The museum didn't officially endorse the legends, but didn't vigorously debunk them either. The mystery was good for business. This tacit tolerance of the treasure legends created its own complications. By allowing visitors to arrive with expectations shaped by treasure mythology, the castle drew audiences whose primary interest was the possibility of hidden riches rather than genuine historical understanding. This audience was enthusiastic, but poorly served by the actual experience. The tunnels were visually interesting, but contained no treasure hunt drama. Some visitors left disappointed. Others left more convinced than ever that the treasure was somewhere the official tour hadn't taken them. The mythology and the reality existed in uncomfortable parallel, each reinforcing the other's distortions. By 1989, when communism fell, Książ was established regional tourist destination. The castle had survived destruction, endured communist control, and achieved stable existence as museum and historic site. But the full history, particularly the Nazi period and its atrocities, remained incompletely addressed. The democratic transformation of Poland created opportunity for more honest historical reckoning. The castle could acknowledge its complete history without ideological constraints. The Nazi tunnels could be explained as what they actually were: forced labor construction site where prisoners died. The treasure legends could be definitively addressed. The Hochberg family history could be told completely rather than selectively. This more honest approach to Książ's history would develop through the 1990s and 2000s as Poland confronted its complex 20th century past and as historical scholarship became more rigorous and less politically constrained. Chapter 7. The Democratic Era and Historical Truth, 1990 to 2010. The fall of communism in 1989 transformed how Książ addressed its history. Under communist rule, historical interpretation had been ideologically constrained. The feudal period was presented as oppressive. The Nazi period was acknowledged but sanitized. The forced labor and deaths were mentioned minimally. The complexity was reduced to simple narratives fitting communist ideology. Democratic Poland allowed more nuanced historical presentation. Historians could research and publish findings without political censorship. The Castle Museum could present complex history, including uncomfortable aspects. Visitors could access fuller truth about what happened at Książ. The Nazi period became central focus of new historical research. Scholars gained access to previously restricted archives. Survivor testimony from forced laborers was collected more systematically. The construction of the tunnels and the human cost were documented rigorously. Research established that thousands of prisoners worked at Książ between 1941 and 1945. They came from concentration camps including Gross Rosen. They lived in brutal conditions in camps around the castle. They excavated the tunnels using primitive tools and explosives. They died from exhaustion, accidents, disease, and deliberate violence. The death toll was reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. At least 13,000 prisoners passed through the labor camps associated with Project Riese across the region. Of these, estimates suggest 5,000 died. At Książ specifically, hundreds certainly died, possibly over 1,000. The exact number remains uncertain because Nazi records were deliberately incomplete, and many were destroyed. Memorial plaques were installed at the castle and at identified mass grave sites. The victims were acknowledged by name when names could be recovered from surviving documentation. Educational materials explained the forced labor system and the deaths that occurred. The castle's Nazi history was no longer minimized. The treasure legends were addressed directly. The museum commissioned scientific studies using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to survey the mountain thoroughly. These studies found no evidence of hidden chambers containing treasure. The Nazi train legend was definitively debunked. No train tracks extended into sealed tunnels. No anomalies suggested hidden train. The story was pure folklore. In 2015, two treasure hunters claimed to have found the Nazi train using ground-penetrating radar. Media coverage was intense. The Polish government took the claim seriously enough to authorize excavation. Experts from multiple countries participated. The site was excavated carefully. Nothing was found, no train, no tunnel, no treasure. The ground-penetrating radar readings that seemed to show something were geological formations, not human construction. The 2015 incident definitively proved the Nazi train legend was false. Yet even this definitive debunking didn't completely kill the legend. Some treasure hunters still believe, searching for alternative locations or claiming the excavation was cover-up. The castle's restoration accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s with Poland's growing prosperity and European Union structural funds. More Baroque rooms were reconstructed. The gardens were partially restored to historical designs. Modern conservation techniques were applied to protect historic fabric. The tunnels received professional archaeological and geological assessment. Sections were stabilized for safe visitor access. Other areas were permanently sealed due to instability. The complex was mapped completely using modern surveying technology. The full extent of Nazi construction was finally documented. Approximately 9 kilometers of tunnels and passages in various states of completion. This documentation revealed the ambition and failure of the Nazi project. The tunnels were extensive but incomplete. Many chambers were partially carved but never finished. Passages ended abruptly. The construction was abandoned mid-process. The scale suggested major installation was planned. The incompleteness proved it never materialized. Educational programming developed around multiple aspects of Książ's history. School groups visited to learn about medieval architecture, Baroque culture, Nazi crimes, and post-war historical memory. The castle became teaching tool rather than just tourist attraction. International cooperation increased. German historians and institutions partnered with Polish counterparts to research the Nazi period. The Hochberg family descendants were contacted, and some family archives were made available for historical research. The history became genuinely international collaboration rather than nationalist narrative. The castle's governance was professionalized. Museum standards improved. Conservation followed international best practices. Tourism was managed to balance revenue generation with heritage protection. Książ transformed from communist-era tourist site to professionally operated cultural institution. By 2010, Książ had achieved stable identity as historic site acknowledging its complete complex history. The medieval origins, Baroque glory, Nazi crimes, communist period, and democratic restoration were all presented honestly. The treasure legends were debunked while being acknowledged as part of the castle's cultural mythology. The underground tunnels were explained as incomplete Nazi construction rather than mysterious secret chambers. The castle had become model for how post-communist cultural institutions could address difficult histories honestly while serving educational and tourism purposes. The approach balanced commemoration of victims, historical accuracy, and practical sustainability. Chapter 8. The Castle Today and the Ongoing Questions, 2010 to present. Książ Castle today receives approximately 300,000 visitors annually. The restored Baroque rooms are the main attraction. The ornate interiors, reconstructed based on historical evidence, give visitors sense of aristocratic life. The gardens, partially restored to Baroque designs, provide scenic complement to the architecture. The mountain location offers spectacular views. The castle succeeds as heritage tourism destination, but the tunnels remain the element generating most public fascination. Despite thorough debunking of treasure legends, visitors are drawn to the underground complex, the passages carved by forced labor, the incomplete chambers suggesting mysterious purposes, the physical evidence of Nazi ambition and failure. The museum has developed sophisticated interpretation of the tunnel system. Educational displays explain the construction process, the forced labor system, the documented deaths, and the ongoing uncertainty about the tunnel's intended purpose. Visitors receive historical context rather than sensationalized mystery. The question of purpose remains genuinely unresolved despite research. No documents have been found definitively stating what the Książ complex was for. Various theories are supported by fragmentary evidence, but none is proven conclusively. This creates unusual situation, legitimate historical mystery that resists treasure hunting exploitation but remains intellectually intriguing. Recent scholarship suggests the purpose may have evolved during construction. Initially planned for one use, possibly Hitler's headquarters, then adapted as Germany's situation deteriorated, perhaps for weapons production or document storage, but never finished because resources and time ran out. The incompleteness may be why no clear purpose is documented. The project was abandoned before its final form was realized. The castle continues requiring substantial investment for conservation. Historic structures demand ongoing maintenance. The tunnels need continuous monitoring for stability. Climate control protects the restored interiors. Modern conservation is expensive but necessary for preserving the site. Funding comes from multiple sources. Admission fees generate significant revenue. Polish government provides support. European Union structural funds support major conservation projects. Private sponsorship contributes. The castle operates as sustainable enterprise balancing commercial tourism with conservation imperatives. The educational mission has expanded to include programs on broader historical themes. The castle hosts conferences on topics ranging from Baroque architecture to Holocaust memory to post-communist historical reckoning. The site serves scholarly purposes beyond simply being tourist destination. Digital technology enhances visitor experience. Virtual reality presentations reconstruct Baroque interiors that can't be physically restored. Digital archives make historical documents accessible. Online resources extend the educational mission beyond physical visitors. The castle participates in international digital heritage initiatives. Climate change creates new conservation challenges. Increased rainfall affects the mountain's stability. Temperature fluctuations stress historic materials. Extreme weather events damage gardens and grounds. Conservation strategies must adapt to changing environmental conditions while preserving historic fabric. The mass grave sites associated with forced labor are maintained as memorial spaces. Markers identify known burial locations. Annual commemorations honor victims. Educational materials ensure visitors understand the human cost of the tunnel construction. The memory work is ongoing obligation. The relationship with German partner institutions has developed positively. Joint research projects, shared educational programs, collaborative conservation efforts. The history that once divided now enables cooperation in service to shared European memory and mutual understanding. The treasure hunters haven't completely disappeared. occasional claims still surface about new evidence of hidden chambers or buried gold. Each is investigated and debunked. The museum staff has become expert at addressing these claims professionally while educating claimants about actual history. The patience required is substantial but necessary. Neo-Nazi interest in Książ has been minimal compared to other Nazi sites. The incomplete tunnels don't offer the symbolic validation that other locations provide. The emphasis on forced labor and deaths makes the site unwelcoming to Nazi sympathizers. The historical presentation is explicitly anti-Nazi. This has largely prevented the problematic visitation that haunts some other former Nazi facilities. Dr. Olczak describes the contemporary mission. Książ is many things simultaneously. Tourist destination generating revenue, conservation project protecting architectural heritage, educational institution teaching history, memorial honoring victims, research center advancing scholarship. These functions must coexist productively. The castle's value is precisely in this complexity. It resists simple categorization, demands engagement with multiple pasts, teaches through its contradictions. The castle's future involves balancing these multiple functions while adapting to changing circumstances. Tourism will likely increase as Poland's economy grows and international travel expands. This creates both opportunity and challenge, more revenue for conservation, more pressure on historic fabric. The tunnels will remain central to visitor interest. The mystery of their purpose, legitimate historical question rather than treasure-hunting fantasy, will continue attracting curious visitors. The educational challenge is maintaining distinction between responsible historical inquiry and sensationalized speculation. Książ represents particular type of heritage site, layered history where medieval, Baroque, Nazi, communist, and democratic periods all contributed to what exists today. Each layer is visible. None can be separated from the others. The complexity is the story. The castle on the mountain with tunnels underneath. Medieval fortress that became Baroque Palace that was converted to Nazi construction site that became communist tourist attraction that is now democratic heritage institution. 700 years of history compressed into one structure and the mountain beneath it. The tunnels still descend into darkness. 9 kilometers of passages carved by forced labor. Chambers that never fulfilled their intended purpose because that purpose was never achieved or perhaps never definitively decided. The underground city that was never finished and will always be incomplete. Książ, the castle with secrets underground. Some secrets revealed through research and documentation. Others remaining mysterious because the evidence doesn't exist to resolve them. The complexity that makes the site historically valuable while resisting simple interpretation.